You know, the Brown family was quite a large family in Lead Hill because my mother and dad had 10 children. I was in the fortunate last two, so you know the last two, the younger ones, always get all the perks. The old ones are supposed to take care of the younger ones. Well, that happened most of the time, particularly because I was a boy. So I was the last youngest boy. So I think that most of them thought that I got most of the blessings from the Brown family. But anyway, I kindly first remember being in Old Lead Hill back when I was born in December of 1939. And Dr. Kirby in Harrison actually made the trip over from Harrison to deliver me in the home in Old Lead Hill. My dad, he owned the general store there in town, and you could identify that general store in some of the photographs, but there was a gas pump out in the front of it. And it was one of those old gas pumps that you pull back and back on the lever so you loaded so much gas in it, and then gravity, you could just, it would go into the tank. But anyway, he owned that general store, but he also had a feed store behind, and that's he was in the feed business as well. And also, our house was actually located in the same block. And some of you may remember seeing from some of the pictures in the Sugarloaf that the church that had Berta Lee Green walking up the steps, that was right behind the house on the other side of the road. And that's where we went to church. And so just a step ahead a little there is Berta Lee Green and I, same age, same class, and Perry Rayleigh being one of the others. And we three were baptized together back in the early days from when we were at that church. And we were baptized right down here below the hill here in what was called the Old Rock Hole. And so I think Berta Lee mentioned in her thing there about us laughing in there. Well, she didn't tell it all. We were laughing, and she said it's because we were happy, and maybe we were, but also when they got to Perry and the current was going down the road, he had his handkerchief up, and the handkerchief fell out of his mouth, and it started running and flowing down the creek, and that's what we were really laughing at. And anyway, you know, down at there was a general store there where we lived, and you also saw some of the pictures of my sister and maybe myself and somebody else, and it said Wilma in the Cabbage Patch. But that was the garden that was behind the house, and we had a large garden there. In fact, it occupied a full city block. Now, across the road there coming into town, there was a filling station. And that was what we call Taft and Abel's filling station, and their daughter, Katie. And you might remember Katie Hudson or Katie Dietz, who passed away several years ago. But there's a story on Katie, and it's absolutely true. Katie sat in that road out there, how we kept from her getting run over, we don't know, because she sat out there eating dirt all day. But if dirt hurt anybody, she would not have survived childhood. So, but I'm sure she was immune from a lot of stuff. And also down in the old town, across the road from the general store was the old cotton gin, which you will see on some of those. The most thing I remember about the cotton gin is that's where all, and I say men, went around to relieve themselves. When they came to town, they didn't have where to go. They'd go around behind that cotton gin. And the creek was right behind there. And it was always amazing to me because when that creek would get up, that creek would come nearly to the top of the bank of that there. And I was always fascinated to run down there to see how high the creek got up that night. And it got up pretty high. Up in the house, I had, in my earliest days, my brothers, Claude and Walter Ray, both were there, and they lived, or didn't live, they stayed in the upper side, up second story of the house, and they liked to hunt, and they hunted anything there was. And I can remember that my mother would come out and she would holler at them and stuff, "Don't you guys be bringing home those skunks." And they said, "Oh, but they smell so good." And I don't think it stopped them a bit. But one time on me though, they were going to show me how to trap one. Not a skunk. It was one of the other varmints, and they had these steel traps. Well, I didn't know any better, and they said, "Now, first thing you have to do when you're there is you have to throw that trap." And I said, "Well, I don't know how you do that." They said, "Well, you stick your finger right down there and hit that thing there, and it'll release it." Well, I did, and it almost cut my finger off. I think my mother had something to say about that also, because it's a wonder I still got that hand. Anyway, also there was so much room in that house that when some of the brothers and sisters got married and so forth, some of them would live up there for a while. In fact, Eileen lived up there for quite a while Hal was in the service. And then, of course, when he came back, then they bought a place and they lived in their own home. And let's see if there's something else. I'll tell you about the skunk. The gas station, Katy. Down on the main street, there was also the theater. There was a bank. And I think that bank was later the post office, because I saw it in the pictures over there. And a lot of other stores. There was a drug store. There was a restaurant down the road there. It's Ethel's. And then there was the drug store. That was Ethel's Drug Store. Well, when I was about as high as this table, I can remember this, running down, because back in those days, I had free run of the whole street. Wherever I wanted to go, nobody stopped me. And I'd go down there and I'd jump up on one of those little stools she had there, and I'd say, "Miss Ethel, I need an ice cream cone." And she'd go fix me an ice cream cone, and she'd give it to me. And I said, "Now you charge it to Wilma." That was my sister. That got to be the story there, me always charging whatever I got to my sister Wilma. And let's see, in those days, since my next sisters on up, Wilma, Dorothy Jo Clary, Dorothy Jo Austin, she was in the same class as my sister. They kind of became my caretakers and babysitters. So they carried me all over that town, because I guess that I'd been put in charge of them, and everywhere they'd go, they had to take me with them. So they kept me safe on that time, but everywhere they went, I had to go too. We also had that time, because my dad had that feed store, and we had an old Ford truck. I think it was like a 36 Ford. It's those kind that had running boards, also had headlights on the front that stood up. Well, that was before the days of safety on vehicles. So the older ones could ride on the running boards, so forth, and the older, and even myself, we could straddle the headlights and drive, and they'd drive everywhere on that car. And it was an old, ever how many gears there was in that thing, but they'd drive down that road in that old truck. Later on, of course, when the lake started coming up, my dad was going to have to sell the store, because they were going to wipe the town out down here, and he did sell the town and the house, and he bought the farm just about a half a mile to the left here from me, so we had to move. And I can remember that day, because I went to school in the morning, and they told me when I came home I wouldn't be coming back there, and I think I was real sad about that, because I had had a good time growing up in the old town, and particularly the freedom that we had in those days of being that little kid who they would just let run wild and was not afraid of anything happening to us. And so we got out there on the farm, and I think by that time, most of all my sisters and brothers, with except my one younger sister, Charlotte, were gone. Mary Ruth and Leon, they lived in the upstairs, a part of that house, that big house, and I haven't been able to find a whole lot, and I don't know whether that'll show up, but there's that big old house that was out there. Later on, when that house was sold, the people unfortunately took the top second floor off of that house, and it was a real shame. That house was built in 1860, and I remember my dad saying on that, and hearing him say about it, there was not one knothole in the whole house. But that picture there, you may see it later on this here, but there's a buggy out front, and there's somebody sitting on the porch. I don't know who that was, but that would be in the 1800s. But I had, this was my room, was right up here. And of course, when we moved out there was no running water in the house. Actually, there was no electricity at that house at that time. But this was my room up here. The middle one was my sister's, and I believe Mary Ruth was on this side over here. And then when she and Mary Ruth married, on the far side, they had all three of those together for their living quarters. But I'll tie this back to Roger's deal. One day he was giving a talk, and he was telling about the Indians being in that area. And he said, but I've searched over and over trying to find out where they got their water. And all I know is that there was a spring somewhere, but they got the water. And I said, well, I know that spring. I said, that's where we got our water for a long time. And when my dad finally got a pump and a pipe to go down there in that spring, that's where we finally got our water out of that pump. So I hopefully that he got down there and found that spring to see it, because he was missing a piece of information, and so I was glad I could help him out on that. By the way, in the summertime, it was so hot on that second floor, I would crawl out on that porch top and sleep out there if I could. And in the wintertime, it was so cold, all you could hear at night was those humming of those electric lines that going down the road. That's my remembrances of that. See if there was anything else. Well, that was me as a cutie. In the house here, and back in those days, they'd have a living area, and then they'd have a parlor. If you remember, they would have a parlor. Well, the parlor was always not to be gone into. That was only for the boys or girls and their girlfriends to meet. Well, back in that time, y'all remember John Carroll Casey probably. Well, he and Joyce, they were the couple. So I don't know whether Joyce was not allowed to go with him anywhere. But anyway, he came to the house. They were sitting in the parlor one time, and I kept going in there, aggravating them. And so John Carroll says, what would it take you to leave? I said, a quarter. And he gave me a quarter, and I left him alone from that time. But anyway, there was an old upright piano in that parlor room, and I'd go in there and I'd hit plunk that thing. And I had an ear for knowing the relationships of notes. So I could, by knowing where those notes was, I could fathom the tunes by hitting those particular notes. That's how I kind of learned. And and my mother and dad, they always encouraged me on that. And then as I picked on up, it became more of a talent to me. And has continued to this day. This was my beautiful mother back when, about the day she was married.
Oh, I have her picture.
Yes, you do. I cut that out.
I colorized her picture.
Yes, you did. Very nice. She's a Yoakum from Peel. My mother and dad were both born in Peel, Arkansas. And I think she was 19 and he was 20. She was She was 16 or 17, and he was 20 or 21 on that age. But they actually relocated over into Missouri after they were married, and he had a store over there at Pontiac, past Gainesville over that way. And that was before they came to Lead Hill. From there, when they came over here, of course, my sister and I, after we moved over there was only Charlotte and I, but Mary Ruth and Eileen lived in the area. They both taught school. Georgia, being the oldest one, she taught school in Dodge City. She rode a horse back and forth to school. And Eileen, she taught down in Possum Trot, and then she later also taught at Dodge City. I saw a letter of hers when she said, I've got to give it to the board, I've got to give up the school. She said, these roads are tearing up my tires, and I cannot afford to buy new tires. So I can't teach over here anymore. But then Eileen finished her 44 years here in Lead Hill, and Mary Ruth about 30 or 40 years in Bergman. And then I graduated Lead Hill with a class of 57. Most of us are still alive, and Embry's here. He's one of our 57 group. But I appreciate you, Don and John, letting me have this time together.